Yes, Louisa? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. It is evening here in London, and my name is Louisa Uliet, and I'm curator of talks and events at the Photographers Gallery. We're delighted to be here with curators Pavel Vančát, who is joining us from the Czech Republic, and Clare Grafik. Clare is head of exhibitions at the Photographers Gallery, and together with Pavel, curated the current exhibition of Jan Svoboda's work titled Against the Light, which is the first major retrospective of the photographer in the UK since his passing in 1990, and is still open until the 20th of September. In addition to the Jan Svoboda show, Clare has curated exhibitions on the work of Terence Simon, Zenev Zadira, and Keith Arnett. She was a sessional lecturer at Birkbeck College in London and has spoken at institutions including the University of the Arts, University of South Wales, and Sotheby's Institute. Pavel is a Prague-based curator focused on the history of photography and contemporary art. In addition to working in galleries, he has also authored several books, including Mutating Medium, Photography in Czech Art, 1990 to 2010, and Jan Svoboda's I Am Not a Photographer, the publication of which coincides with our show at the Photographers Gallery. I know my screen's frozen in my introduction. After the presentation today, after the discussion and presentation, we will move to questions and comments from you using either the chat function here or the Zoom function that allows you to raise your hand electronically. We will then unmute you so you can speak. The event should last roughly 1 hour. Please note that we are recording this, so if you do not wish to be featured, please turn off your camera. We are approaching this event in the same way we do with all of our public programs, which is with the aim of creating a forum of trust and mutual respect, so please keep that in mind. I hope today's discussion inspires you, and we look forward to seeing you again here or during some of our other planned activity or in the gallery, hopefully, which is now open. So thank you again for joining us. Now to Pavel Vančát and Clare Grafik.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all here. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this show, because as you can imagine, we were completely gutted when the lockdown happened, and just a few weeks into the exhibition. And it's hard to imagine a worse show to have to look at online, I have to say. One of my absolute loves of Jan Svoboda's work, and one of the reasons I was so keen to bring it to London, was that it was work that you really need to see physically and have a kind of physical interaction with. And it felt very important to be reminded of that somehow in these days where so much of what we see is online, to actually remind ourselves what it's like to have a kind of physical, to be reminded of how nourishing and important a physical relationship can be to visual culture in that way. So on the one hand, it's terrible work to look at in this format, but on the other hand, I'd like to think that the themes in the work, and particularly the fact that really most of Svoboda's practice was done from his own room in his own studio with you know, not going out, but chimes with our lockdown mentality a bit, and hopefully, I don't know, gives us a little bit of a sense of, you know, what can be achieved in the confines of our own homes, or what can be achieved in terms of thinking through images that are produced in that way. So I have found great solace in the Svoboda work in the last few months of COVID and being stuck at home. And I hope you have too, but I would love to remind you that just we have managed to secure the loans for a few more weeks. So the gallery is open until the 20th of September. So if any of you do get the chance to come into town, we'd love to see you at the gallery and just for you to actually experience the work in that way as well. I first came across Svoboda's work through Pavel coming to London and very kindly coming to talk to me about the work and showing me the very handsome book that he produced of Jan Svoboda's practice. And I absolutely loved it. And at the time this is a long time ago, at the time I was working on a show called Perspectives on Collage at the gallery, it's a group show about collage practices, which happened in 2013. And so we were lucky enough to feature, I think it was 3 works from Svoboda in that show. And it got such a good reaction, and there was so much interest in these 3 very quiet, against some very bombastic other work in the show actually, but just had really chimed with people in a way that, you know, just made me think there's so much more to look at in terms of this person's work, and also the sort of singularity of it felt very different from other work that was, you know, being seen at the time. And still is being seen in public galleries around the UK. So anyway, I was very pleased after many years of trying that we managed to make the show happen. But really it's through Pavel's passion for Svoboda's work and his amazing knowledge of it, and his brilliant relationships with collectors and collections of Svoboda's work that's really made this possible. So it's really down to Pavel and his energy that have allowed this show to go ahead. So I must thank him for that very much. So I'm going to, for my best abilities, keep an eye on the chat function while Pavel talks us through the exhibition. If there are questions that come up that seem relevant to what Pavel's talking about, I'll interject and ask him. I'll ask him those questions. If there are ones that seem better, perhaps at the end when we have a more general discussion, I'll leave them. So don't think I've left you behind. It's just I'll try and keep Pavel sort of going in terms of his narrative around the show, and hopefully look forward to having a conversation at the end. So again, thank you very much for coming, and thanks to Pavel too.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks very much for lovely introduction, and thank you back for perfect cooperation, and thanks to everybody for getting in tonight, and many greetings from Prague, from the city of Svoboda, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation, which should somehow substitute the direct encounter with the work. As Claire noted already, it's quite difficult, but we'll try our best at least to give you a hint of the main qualities and main specialties in Svoboda's work. So as Claire mentioned, I'm interested in Svoboda's works for about 15 years already, and I think he's one of the most interesting Czech photographers, probably the next one after Josef Sudek, like the heir of his tradition, and somebody who kind of overcame the traditional photography somewhere to the realm of concept into general thinking about a modern image, or even linking almost to like postmodern universe of the image. And when we try to make the exhibition, so we try to get the best possible images from all best collections which are having Svoboda's work. The main one is the Moravian Gallery in Brno, as you can see the mention down in the text. And so they supplied about 1/2 of the exhibition. The rest is coming from smaller collections, from mostly private collections and from family collection. And I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to see the exhibition directly, but I would strongly advise you to do it in the time which is left, which is about 2 weeks, I think, or 1 and something, till the 20th of September. And just to give you a brief introduction into who Jan Svoboda was, so there are a few slides here which should give you the basic insight. So you can think about him as someone being born before the Second War and kind of very much influenced by the post-war mentality of trying to secure the peace and even aesthetic peace for the humankind, and trying to express himself somehow through art. So he was originally trained as a porcelain modeler, but shortly he had his ambitions further as a poet, and then when he found out that he's even more interested into images which could somehow supply his poetry with more, let's say, with more input or more content. So he started to illustrate the poetry with his images in late 1950s, which then led him to photography as the, let's say, most approachable art of the time. And what was a crucial point for his career was the encounter with the work of Josef Sudek in 1958, which showed him the path, let's say, for his early career in the late 50s, early 60s, into trying to do what he meant to be artistic photography. And if I could speak of like his early career, so it was very much influenced by the group of artists around him, by Stanislav Kolíbal, by Zdeněk Palcer, and also by his peer from his high school, from Jan Svoboda, who you might know as an important, let's say, post-surrealistic filmmaker. So all these personalities of Czech art of 1960s were very influential to him, and Svoboda's ambition was somehow to kind of raise photography to the level of the visual art of the period. Back then, photography was something which was more like a reproductive, something which was more meant to be published in a magazine, to be reproduced in a book, to be sold cheaply as a reproduction of something. But to have a photography as kind of solitary work of art was something which back in the 60s was still unpredictable. And as you can see on this slide, from the exhibition in 1968, which was Svoboda's first solo show. So you can see a wonderful installation which was done by Stanislav Kolíbal, maybe the most important sculptor of 1960s, 1970s. And he not only installed the works on the walls in very special, like, let's say, graphic design setting, but he also decided to put some of the photos on special stands on the ground, on this like musical stand in the middle, and also to use the autumn leaves to be filling all the floor of the exhibition. And here you can see some kind of let's say mutual searching for some atmosphere, for some existential feeling, which they share together quite strongly. And what's important, that Svoboda played like a mutual role in this dialogue. So he was for several years, he was like prominent documentator of Stanislav Kolíbal's work, and the work which you can see on the right is in fact work which is now in London in the courtyard of Czech embassy, close to Westminster Palace, right? Westminster, I'm not sure.
Kensington
Garden. Yeah. So close to Kensington Gardens. So there's Czech embassy, which was built in late 1960s, and in fact Stanislav Kolíbal has done a huge sculptural wall on the facade of the embassy, and also in the courtyard you can find this sculpture, which was then documented by Jan Svoboda. And in fact, we were inspired by this to make another smaller exhibition for the embassy, which shows this mutual relation between Kolíbal and Svoboda as two crucial personalities of Czech art of the 60s and 70s. So if you go nearby, so you can take a look. And going further into the biography, so in fact the crucial point even for this exhibition, which is now in London, was the show in 1982, which was at the Photographers Gallery back then in the old venue in at the, where was this? Claire, what was the street? I forgot it.
Street, yes. I should just say to everyone, it's not Pavel torturing his children. They're just very excited after coming back from kindergarten, probably. Yes, Great Newport Street. So this was this would have been this show actually happened. This was probably one of the first shows that happened at number 5 Great Newport Street at the Photographers Gallery, which started life in 1971 at number 8 Great Newport Street. So for anyone that knows the old premises, we were split over 2 buildings, number 8 and number 5. And so it's interesting, Sue Davies, the director there, who you can see holding the baby in the photograph, she was sort of instrumental in pushing to get this show over, his show over to London, but very much with the help of some kind of key figures, particularly the British artist John Gatto, who was very keen to bring the work over to London. And it's hard to imagine, I suppose, now the context within which this work would have been seen in terms of whether people understood what Svoboda was trying to do or not. I think John Gatto himself had some sense that there was perhaps too much of a influence of North American photography on the British photographic scene at that time, and that there was he felt very strong. I mean, you can correct me, Pavel, but I believe there was a sense that he wanted to kind of redress the balance a bit by promoting Eastern European work on a sort of equal footing to the North American photographic scene, which the UK kind of naturally veered towards. And of course, the influences on the Eastern European scene were very different. We were fundamentally different to what you saw in North America at the time. So I think there was reading through parts of the archive and Sue Davies' sort of reaction to the Svoboda show. I think she was rather disappointed. I think she sort of felt like people didn't quite know what to make of it. But at the same time, I think it did make a big impression on a few key people in the UK who saw that work. But it's sad, you know, obviously Svoboda himself wasn't able to come and see the show himself, which in 1982 could have made quite a big impact on Svoboda, I think, psychologically as much as anything, just to see that work shown somewhere like the Photographers Gallery.
That's right. Well, in fact, he wasn't really allowed to come over, and he even had his personal health problems and even some mental problems which were combined with political difficulties. So in the end, it was Antonín Dufek, the curator of the exhibition, who presented the show in London, and so that was sad coincidence, which in fact led even 1 year later, Svoboda, you can see that John Gozzo, in fact, in Prague, or in Roudnice, nearby Prague, where he attended the exhibition of Svoboda and Sudek. And it was another crucial moment of Svoboda's life when he, on one hand, he was kind of professionally acclaimed to be like the successor of Sudek in like professional circles by this exhibition, Svoboda and Sudek, in 1983. On the other hand, in fact, the installation is again by Stanislav Kolíbal, the one who did the first show in 1968. And on the other hand, he was kind of expelled from the Museum of Decorative Arts, where he worked as a photographer. And for next 7 years of his life, he was without regular income. So that was like a beginning of his final decline and of his like struggle to be fully appreciated as a important photography, for which was just in very narrow circles. But basically, as Claire noted with the London exhibition, I would say it was still too early to really recognize his real importance and like the real depth of his, attribution to the language of photography. So as you can see in the timeline, that the 1980s were kind of time when he mostly struggled, and he died, in fact, at the in the last days, probably in the last days of 1989 or in the first days of 1990, being found, in fact, a few days later, after just a few weeks after the Velvet Revolution exploded in Prague and brought the country to liberation. So in the same time, Svoboda was all alone in his flat and found dead by his friends later. So since then, it's I'm definitely the first one who tried to like revive his legacy, and both Antonín Dufek, the curator of 1982 exhibition, did big retrospective in 1994 in the Moravian Gallery, and then Anna Fárová, probably the most prominent art historian specialized in photography, who was also, in fact, the main interpreter of Josef Sudek. So she also intervened very much into the sale of his of Svoboda's estate to the Moravian Gallery in Brno, which then cooperated on this exhibition in London. And as is mentioned here, so together with Jiří Pátek, who's now the curator of photography at the Moravian Gallery, we published the book which Luisa showed you in the beginning, and which you can still find in the bookshop of the Photographers Gallery, which in fact made the basis and the research basis for this exhibition, and hopefully even for some further exhibitions in after we get out of these struggles and limitations. So that's kind of introduction, and now I would like to take you to the exhibition itself. If probably most of you didn't have a chance to go through it, so just to give you a rough idea how we decided to put it together, and also to show you some special details to give you some deeper insights into what's the quality of the work. So here you can see the beginning of the exhibition, which is kind of leading you into the early work of Svoboda, where we are still in late 50s, early 60s, where he's still like trying to compete in a way with the legacy of Josef Sudek and trying to find his own pictorial language. And as I'm zooming into this image, I go there and back. So you can, this is one crucial image, kind of legendary image of 1963, which is called Melancholy, and which...
Pavel, we can only see the top of your head.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. So now raise up. So that's picture called named Melancholy from 1963, and it shows nicely the, let's say, Sudek's tradition in Svoboda's works, but on the other hand, it shows already the ambitions he had toward like liberating the photographic image. And you have to go see it back on wall in large to see that in fact it's kind of being put on a wall with the already as on a thin board, which is even having this rounded corners, and it's not framed photograph anymore. It's kind of object which is kind of beautified by this round corners, and especially by very deep tones, which they are like kind of underdeveloped in the print room. So in fact, it's readable only when you get to it to 1 or 2 meters. Otherwise, it's kind of glimpses or kind of blends together into dark, into one dark shape. But you have to kind of dive into it to fully understand all those like small details, small structural minimal fragments which you can see in there. And that's something which Svoboda played with then further, with this being like one of the first real attempts into like presenting photography as a kind of partly sculptural, partly, say, painterly experiment with the tone, with the velour of photography. And so that's the earliest example of it. And with these few more images around it, you can see how he started his career here on the right. In fact, you can see the earliest series in his work. That's the view of the gasworks from 1957 and 58, still in Sudek's tradition. Here you can see it slightly better, and then some other attempts. For example, the bottles on the left are almost like quoting the Sudek's still lifes photographed on his own window. On the other hand, the picture on the left has beautiful title, which is Against the Light, and then it's in commas, literally. So the whole title is Against the Light, literally. So it's not only like describing the light situation, but it's also describing some struggle he had with the light conditions, with the, let's say, photography itself, and which he expressed even in his later work, that it's kind of him fighting against the light, fighting against the medium of the light, the medium of photography. And even in this early work, which is coming from 1960, I think 5 or 6. So it's kind of starting this this fight, which goes further. And then when we were doing the exhibition, so we wanted to show the full possibilities of Svoboda's work, which was in fact kind of expanding through the 60s to find, let's say, the full language of his work in late 60s, early 70s. And you can see here the installation, even including this wonderful glass wall, which the installation crew of Photographers Gallery made very nicely, and that shows somehow, in fact, the thinking of Svoboda in the late 60s and early 70s, in the meaning that he started to work in cycles, which was something very unusual for photographers of that time, that he would take a topic, and in kind of conceptual tradition, and conceptual art was something very new back then in the late 60s. So even in the field of photography, he started to kind of develop one idea in cycles, which were then numbered one after another. So for example, this table series, which is most extensive cycle of Svoboda, was leading up to 50 work in the series. So you can see how he took one single table, which he was photographing at his home, and he was looking at it in different light conditions, in different angles, in different atmospheres, and trying to kind of revive the table into some kind of symbolic actor of some specific drama he was kind of acting every day with it, with those small details meaning different things. So you can see somehow like the fine substance which he tried to invoke, especially if you see it, see the bigger images. And what's very important with Svoboda is that I already mentioned that he, in fact, he didn't like the frames, he didn't like the let's say the usual installation of photography of the 60s and 70s, and instead of presenting it in a frame or in a passepartout, so he presented it as a solitary image, which was hanging on a wall, kind of floating on a wall, floating on a on a white background, as something which has its own kind of sculpture, like a flat sculpture substance. So, for example, with this image, which shows one of his images, but torn apart, and then photographed again. So I can here you can see the back of it, which has this kind of support from the back, which holds it a little bit aside from the wall, or a little bit leaned out, and has this metal frame around it, which gives it kind of sculptural substance.
So, Pavel, can I ask something about that? Because it's interesting that he starts using the cardboard backing with this metal rod thing, mm-hmm, to bring the work out from the wall. He starts using that quite early on in his work, doesn't he? Because even the Gaswork series from '57 are mounted on something.
They mounted already, but they not with the metal frame. The metal frame appears let's say in, I would say, mid 60s, around that time. So that's where the metal frame appears. These are like late 50s. So I think he already had the idea of like little objects, but then to come to this like final setting, which he then used till the end of his life for like exhibition pictures. And it's important also to mention the size. That's the largest images which we can see in an exhibition here. So the largest one are over 1 meter high. So it's size which is completely unusual for photography of that time, which is really like attempting to be fine art, to be something which is overwhelming, which is even having some kind of essential quality. If you see the kind of the image which is used for which was used for the poster of the exhibition, the Space for a Pink Picture. Mm. So you can see something very simple but so magnified that you have to think about it as kind of philosophical gesture, something like kind of fighting with the essence of the reproducibility of the medium, something which is totally unique and which has some kind of solitary substance.
Do you feel that his sort of this idea of transforming the photograph into something much more like an object, do you think that came from his association with people like sculptors like Collibal, or I think I read, or we spoke sometime about whether he actually, that was an idea he got from working a bit in advertising, and it was something to do with the way advertising presented its posters.
I would say both theories are possible. Sadly, we won't get to know the real answer anymore. But as I asked even the older peers, the people who wrote about Svoboda before, so they mentioned both sources, and definitely he was working, as you mentioned, he was working as a like a shop window decorator for most of the 60s, as his work during the week time. So in fact, there was a similar setting with like a support in the back and kind of some cardboard or plywood supports for the images were used, in fact, for the decoration of the shop windows in Prague. So he kind of appropriated this way of this adjustment for his photos, but of course then he kind of purified it and he took it to the most most simple effect or most simple form.
Someone's just asked, do you think this was a way, by presenting the work in that way, do you think he was trying to distance his work from other photography, straight photography? Do you think that was a way of sort of showing a distance between him and other photographers at the time?
Absolutely. He was, in fact, that leads to what I tried to kind of suggest, and Sudek, who was for him like a important example and someone who he admired during all his lifetime, but on the other hand, someone who was kind of his rival in a way, like the older rival, which he tried to overcome, which he tried to cope to. And most of the other photography was kind of uninteresting for him. He was saying that they are all just kind of shooters or snapshotters. So for him, like, photography was something which he in a way hated as for its kind of simplicity, but on the other hand, he tried to kind of establish it into something which would have this kind of, let's say, late modernist substance of like the image which kind of refers to itself, which can build up its own tradition, which can kind of simplify, purify itself to the most possible extent. And I would say this is like the story of Svoboda's work, something similar to, I don't know, like Greenbergian image in let's say painting of the 40s and 50s. So something similar was happening in Svoboda's work during the from the 50s to the early 70s, when let's say his work came to a peak.
Someone's asked a very practical question about, was the frame on the back just taped to the photograph? No, the metal, the photograph was first put onto card, quite a thick card, wasn't it? And then these poles were then taped onto the card itself.
Yeah, they're glued. There's like a brown tape which is holding metal frame, which in fact supports the image not to bend, but on the other hand also to hold it as a, like, to be hanged on the wall, hanging in fact on the edge of the metal support. So, and this one is very special because it's even showing the temporal like 1970s Czech newspapers or magazines, which were used then as a back of the image.
I think actually we looked at it, didn't we? And one of the articles on the back is actually an article about fascist skinhead in Britain at the time.
Yeah, right.
So, but this is a particularly good one with the collage of the magazine on the back. But they are in amazing condition, actually. I mean, a lot of the work in the show is still has this original tape and rods. So yeah.
So that's it. And here you can see the last part of the exhibition, which is the annex. And in fact, the lecture here is based mostly on the annex and on what we were able to collect for it and summarize. And I wanted to mention briefly just few images which are in the show and which I find very crucial. One of them is, as I spoke about, a pictorial tradition. So, and let's say the connection of Svoboda to the contemporary artist of his generation. So he was also very much inspired by let's say modernist painting, and even by late 19th century painting, by like early modernism in painting. And his special love was Paul Cézanne. So he was very much inspired, if you remember the Melancholy photography, which I showed you in the beginning. So this kind of Valère theory, which Cézanne brought into painting. So it was very essential for Svoboda in thinking about how photography could look like, how it could just use its own tonalities, its own kind of being totally darkened or lightened, just playing on the contrasts, which are very dimmed, very subtle. So this theory of Cézanne was then kind of reattributed to photography in Svoboda's work during the late 60s and 70s. And the photograph on the right is even direct evidence of it, where he directly quotes one of the postcards of Cézanne in his image of 1974. And one of the last images we had in the show is the Found Still Life, which is subtitled My Self-Portrait from 1985. And it shows nicely even the thinking of Svoboda of like his lifetime, of his own like biography. And so it's in a way summary of his life, being like in his 50s and looking back at his childhood with his young picture, and then with the marital announcement and one page of his catalog, and then on the bottom you can see one of his photos as a support for these previous images. So this kind of like layering, this kind of thinking of images as kind of overlapping one another, making a new story altogether. So it shows nicely kind of, say, the grown-up wisdom which Svoboda held through his career and which he then developed in his later work. And the last image I wanted to show you is this beautiful, quite unusual image, which we also used very much for the promotion with Claire, as we both loved it. And that's a very simple picture, which is named Three Pairs, and it's kind of symbolizing, in fact, the simplicity of nature, which he loved to capture, very much playing with the symbols of apples, pears, of furniture, of windows, and kind of like simple designs, and then combined with this very temporal, very late 70s, early 80s picture dimmed by the by the paper, but still like kind of combining the temporal with something eternal together into this like small meditation about, let's say, fruits and women. So that's the latest picture we have in the exhibition, and I would say it's also the end of the overview. So, and I see we have quite a lot of time running. So,
yeah, no, thanks, Pavel. There was just a few things I wanted to also just bring up in terms of, it's quite interesting how the medium became his subject, you know, and how he, in a sense, he deconstructed it so much, he almost came to a standstill, because he took it to such an extent that actually, in a sense, this moment you talk about, perhaps in the mid-70s, where he suddenly found he couldn't go any further with it. Was hard to conceive of how to take it further. And I think
I'm just pointing to this photo. I got back to, I think this is a good illustration. If you can see the pre-picture, the fragment of a table. So it's kind of symbol of like his fight with photography.
Yeah. And I think that also something that's perhaps hard to see on the reproductions here is how many times he signed the front of the image. And the use of the idea that the back of the work and the front of the work became almost interchangeable through this deconstruction of the medium, and that actually a lot of the works are, you see a signature on the front and a date often, and that's often shown brilliantly by you alongside works like the back of a photograph, or sorry, the other side of a photograph. Wording, and I think that's something that's also really you know, was really groundbreaking for him to do, and I you know, I think it's probably something important to point out, that this reversal that was happening between the front and the back of the photograph, and the idea that both were sort of equal in some way. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that, but we have this photo, the other side of a photograph in a show, and in fact, even the glass wall is kind of quotation of the like the reverse possibility of like reversing the photo, like looking at the other side, looking at the reverse, and this leads naturally to this like photography as an object, not only as a reproduction, as an image, but as something which has like physical form and which can be then appreciated differently than kind of flat ideal image.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for leading it. Okay, well, so I think I'll be happy to answer any questions together with Claire if you had any, and I hope I didn't exhaust you too much with my lengthy explanations.
No, not at all. So if you have any questions, you can send it through in the chat, or you can use the raise your hand function feature, and then I'll be able to unmute you, because I feel like I've disabled the unmute yourself functions. There was some question from Janice, just on the topic of conservation and whether or not there are any issues with conservation with regards to his work. For one of you guys.
Yeah, conservation, hey. It's very, very I mean, it's super difficult work to look after, because the thickness of the cardboard as well means it's, you know, it's very prone to any changes in humidity, or so it's very carefully, it has to be very carefully dealt with. I mean, the irony is he was terrible at looking after his own photographs, and actually, as Pavel can correct me on this, but I think didn't really care how, you know, if things got a bit dented or you know, scratched. He saw the kind of the life of the work, it wasn't a bad thing for him for the work to sort of show the wear and tear of its use.
Definitely. Yeah.
And so he was, I don't know, it's a funny contradiction in the work in a way, in that he by making this work without a frame, without glass, taken off the wall, he was making it into a unique work, actually in a funny way, much more precious than an edition, than a multiply produced photographic print. But at the same time, didn't mind if the work itself was sort of, started to show its life on its surfaces and, corners. So it's an interesting double bind in the work somehow.
Definitely, like he was counting even with the, in fact, as you can see on this image, that he was counting with the, let's say, damages and even with disasters. So sometimes there's one anecdote that when he gave few photos to Anna Farova, so one of them was having his footprint on it, and they agreed together that in fact it's part of the work already when it's there, and it can be exhibited with it. So this kind of like the even wear off of the time of the, let's say, the lifetime of the work itself. So I would say he was treating them as like some kind of singular entities which are then leading their own life onwards.
Yeah.
Of course, on the other hand, I think sometimes he was in a mood of like protecting them very much as his children, but sometimes he was also very, let's say, rough and very rude to them. So both possibilities were possible.
We have a question directly from an audience member, Rana Eve. Do you want to pose your question directly?
Yeah, thanks. Yes. Yeah, thanks so much. Really interesting. Yeah, I saw the show in person actually, which I was really grateful to do. Yeah, and I really loved it. I really got the sense of I understand what you're saying about the physical and the kind of how the images were like sometimes they were warped and things, and kind of so the relationship of the images to the walls I thought was really interesting. But I'm just struck when you're talking around the kind of what I was asking was something around how productive he was, because there's a sense of kind of minimal simplicity or reductiveness or kind of I guess a kind of sort of poetic distilling in the images, but then it also seems that he was very productive, and I think those two, I wouldn't normally think about those two energies as being together. And then what you were just saying about kind of him sort of making work and sort of not necessarily caring about it, that has a kind of similar quality to me. Does that make? I wondered if you could say something about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, he wasn't very much productive. Like his work was completely different from, let's say, the regular photographer of the time, who was like doing, I don't know, like doing dozens of images every day and then choosing some of them. So Svoboda was in fact working in the opposite direction, that he was kind of observing things to make then a few negatives and then choose one of 5 to be the best one. And I would say from most of the years, from let's say late 50s till let's say the early 80s. So for most of the years, there are, let's say, 10 to 30 images which he kind of published or exhibited. From some of them, there are just few, let's say 5 maybe. But what's even quite struck me was that when he installed his exhibition, so we found out that about 1/2 of the images we have there, and we all tried together with Claire to select, let's say, the ones which we loved most. So most of them are half of them were from 1971, which in fact was such a productive year. So it's almost kind of scared me out how one person could kind of get to such a concentration and to such a, let's say, quick evolution in his thinking and in his work during one single year that in fact it's filling half of the exhibition, and it's leading to so diverse direction that's incredible. So I would say like the peak of his career was extremely productive. On the other hand, then the second half of the 70s, he did almost no images at all. He even publicly announced that he's kind of giving up photography, and till the early 80s he didn't photograph too much, sometimes just few attempts, but there are some theories that he was trying to switch to filmmaking, which he never really succeeded, but I've heard some rumors about it. So I think by the early 70s, around 71, 72, 73, he in fact came to the limits of his work and kind of tried to look for different directions, for some kind of solitude, for some kind of rest. And then it took him several years to kind of revive his creativity and some kind of will to produce something.
Yeah. Question from Anna Lucas. Was he hand printing himself at home, or was he making editions or multiples? I'm wondering if the torn works are darkroom rejects or more precious final works. I think he did print some of his own work, but someone else, he had someone very important was helping him print the larger works at some point. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, he did most of the works till let's say mid 70s. He did most of the works himself, even in his own flat, mostly in his bathroom. And then he had a collaborator and a friend who was kind of his assistant, and luckily he was working for the Czech press agency, kind of state agency of the time. So they kind of smuggled the materials into the printing room of the agency, and then they smuggled it out again, especially for the 1975 retrospective, which was crucial for his work and was kind of like crowning the whole work. So for that, I would say about one half of the images was then printed by his assistant Jiří Poláček.
There's a question actually, just going back to his early career, about the poetry. Does someone want to ask a question about the poetry, or just to have an example of the poem? Sorry, who was it that asked that question about poetry?
Who was that? Whether or not I thought to. Is it possible to find examples of his poetry?
There's a few poems, I think, in the book, isn't there?
Yeah, right. Yeah, they are in the book, and they're a little bit difficult to be translated. Yeah. And I don't think Svoboda really succeeded in poetry. I would say, I wouldn't say his poetry is horrible, but on the other hand, it's not outstanding. It's kind of, let's say, good level, but it's not something which would kind of break the silence or something. And in fact, it shows already some kind of pictorial quality, some.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about it for me.
Sorry?
The visual quality of it is interesting.
Yeah, it speaks often about colors, about atmospheres, about kind of very existential situation, which then reappeared in his own photographs of the 60s. So this kind of like little bit like pathetic or nostalgic situation, which kind of spread out from his poetry of the 50s, kind of reappears again. And what's important is that many of some of the expressions he used for the titles or some verses in his poetry are reappearing again as the titles of his images. So, for example, the image which will not return is in fact early early poem from late 50s, from 58, I think. But then it reappears again 10 years later as kind of, in fact, conceptually based image with this title. And I would say even the strong stress on the titles of his works, and even on the cycles which are then defined by the titles. So this comes from his experience as a poet, as an aspiring like a writer.
Yeah, I find, I mean, I do think the marriage of his titles with the image is it's very tightly tied to the title. To me, they're so evocative, the titles.
Definitely.
And also the titles often extend the work.
Yeah,
that's quite unusual in terms of how the sort of marriage between them feels very kind of essential somehow, the title and the image. There's a question from Anna and asking, I wonder how Svoboda's work influenced the next generation of photographers in the Czech Republic. Did some follow that tradition of photography as object?
I would say there's quite a strong tradition of this kind of photography. It's just questionable if any of them are then kind of expanding it in the way how, for example, Svoboda expanded the tradition of Sudek into some kind of new direction. So I'm a little bit skeptical about like the real successor of Svoboda during the, let's say, 80s and 90s. So I even try to, as I'm working often with photography and even contemporary art and contemporary photography, so I tried to do several exhibitions which were kind of expanding Svoboda's legacy into the, let's say, contemporary photography. And I wouldn't say there's a direct successor to him. There are many who are inspired by him, many who, and he's like a beloved photographer of every, let's say, every Czech, let's say, artist using photography. So he's very much an example for everybody. But to speak about successors, it's quite complicated. They are either, I would say, they are either people who went similar direction but parallelly and are much more younger, for example, like Jiří Tín or maybe Markéta Otová or some others. But on the other hand, the people were just slightly younger and still were his peers during his lifetime. So they are mostly, I would say, just mimicking him, or let's say they are let's say too similar to him to be doing something essential.
There's a message from Ileana saying, I'm quite interested in the conceptual aspects of the work, seen here, for instance, on the screen in this pre-picture, but also the serial approach. Were there connections with conceptual art that you know he was aware of?
Oh, well, I wouldn't say, like, definitely he was aware of the conceptual art through magazines. So he read the conceptual art was published even in like the second half of the 60s, was published in Czech art magazines. They were people who were even having approach to the let's say American or West European magazines by that time. So it wasn't completely divided. So he could have approach to that, and even his peers like Kolíbal were inspired by that. So this kind of serial approach was definitely something which was in the air by that time. It just wasn't usual in photography, and even though you can find some similarities, like with for example, Solevitz's photography of that time, or with later on with I don't know, like Jeff Wall or some others. So I wouldn't say this would be direct. It was just something which he kind of inherited from like the conceptual tradition in fine art, but I wouldn't say he knew about any of his, let's say, contemporaries in photography, in conceptual photography.
A message from Will Brook. Hi, Will. Are there more recent prints made from his original negatives? And to what extent is the visual feel of the images to do with his choices made when printing?
In fact, it's even mentioned on the website of Photographers Gallery that there are new prints being made, in fact, recently, and some of them are in the print shop, in the printing room of the of the gallery. So they were made recently together with the family, and they are quite rare because for last 30 years no one has been trying to print again Svoboda's work, and it's even quite a difficult question, and I was kind of advising the gallery which did the edition, so we discussed it quite deeply that in fact they are not only made after the let's say tonality, which is then in specific collections, but they're also made in exactly the same dimensions as the original ones, because that's also essential that Svoboda claimed that every photograph has its own specific dimension. It cannot be enlarged or minimized, but it has to be in the size he established to it to work properly.
Also, there was I mean, just on a totally practical level, I think there were certain papers that he preferred to use in the darkroom that have a very matte surface, you know, where it feels like the tone is totally within the paper, the photographic paper, and that definitely that's definitely a choice. You know, it suited him. Certain papers must have suited the effect he wanted.
Definitely, and yeah, well, you can hardly find, let's say, original papers from the 60s and 70s. What I know is that he very much preferred Hungarian forte papers, which were kind of like velvetish in a way. So many of the photos were printed on that, but he also used Czech papers as well, and sometimes even German Akfa, which was a little bit less available, but was also sometimes possible to find. So of course, when you make a new edition, so it's difficult to find a proper paper, but as it was printed by one of the best, let's say, black and white printers in Prague, so she found a very nice solution to it, which I think does very good work, or works very well for the images.
I think we're probably coming near the end now, so I've got maybe one or two if anyone wants more questions. One from Aaron. I'm interested in the reductionist and simplifying elements of his work. Do you think there were any influences from abstract expressionist art on him?
I would say so, but mostly you can see it even in this image you're looking at the pre-picture, and you can see it even in, for example, this Melancholy, which I showed much earlier. So you can, I wouldn't say it's abstract expressionism, which was also, I would say, known in 1960s in Prague, but it was more from, let's say, art Brit and art informal, which was much closer, as it was coming mostly from France. The art informal, it was very popular in Prague in the like mid 50s, late 50s. So this kind of existential painting, which was based on abstraction, but was kind of having some kind of like semi-concrete elements in it. So that was something which was like in the air of the period, and that was something he was building up in the beginning, but then kind of using it as a kind of backdrop to something which was much more specific, and which was then playing this like theater of little things, which then made these constellations having sometimes very obvious, sometimes very hidden meanings, sometimes just being like messages to his friends and lovers and so on. So this kind of universe of his imagery.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Are there any other questions? Maybe just one. If anyone's got one more, then we'll perhaps draw it to a close. Anyone else? No. Well,
No.
no. I think we've covered it.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for your brilliant questions. Thanks, Claire, for your sharing. And Pavel, really, for the rich conversation. Oh, no, those aren't more comments, just compliments. Anyway, thank you, lastly, to you, the audience, for your ongoing commitment to the gallery. We really wouldn't be able to do what we do without you. If you have a moment, we'd love to hear from you. So we have a quick poll. It's very fast, 10 questions. You can just touch your screen or use your cursor. And it'd be great to get a sense of how you think we're doing and how you heard about tonight's event. Anyway, I hope you're all okay. Please keep checking our website for updates on forthcoming program or for more information on how to visit the gallery, especially the show before it closes on the 20th. And thanks for spending your evening with us. And yeah, hopefully see you guys soon.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Pavel.
Thank you very much, Luisa. Thanks, Claire, for lovely company, and thank you all for watching.
Yeah.
And if you hadn't seen the show, I'd be delighted if you do so.
Yes, do come.
Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to launch the poll now, and yeah, have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Nice evening.